What was the impact of the Industrial Revolution on American society? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Good to see you again, Richard.
It's good to be with you, our viewers and listeners, in this new year.
All right, Richard, when we were doing our series on the classical economists, one of the terms that often came up, naturally enough, was the Industrial Revolution. So we hear a lot about the Industrial Revolution in the mainstream press, about how horrible things were, the sweatshops. This is all taught in the public schools, the economics classes in colleges, except for your class, of course, but that this was a horrific thing that happened to America. And this really, in my opinion, was the opening for the socialists in America to move America in a socialist direction, because they looked at the plight of the children in the sweatshops, the plight of the family, that both spouses were having to work in what were oftentimes very unhealthy conditions. And they said, we need reforms. We need to reform the system. So that's where you start to get things like the maximum hour legislation, 8-hour day. You get the child labor laws. Then you get regulations to control what's going on in these industries. And you ultimately get the poor relief laws, the Social Security, the Medicare, the welfare, and the rest of this stuff. So I thought, let's have a discussion of the Industrial Revolution itself. That what was it about? What brought it about? What it meant? What was the Industrial Revolution? So since you're the economist and the economic historian, let me pass the baton to you and tell us a little bit about what was the Industrial Revolution? What was its significance?
Well, I think the best way to begin this is to remind people about what life was like for all of human history before the Industrial Revolution. To quote the famous line from Thomas Hobbes from Leviathan, human life was nasty, brutish, and short. Demographers, economic historians who have studied these things have indicated that from basically beginning of time until the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th, that is the end of the 1700s, the beginning of the 1800s, globally, people were living in abject poverty. It's estimated that out of a global population of 1 billion, 90 to 95% lived in abject poverty. The 5%, 10%, they were the nobility, the kings, the church figures and organizations who basically lived off whatever could be taxed or garnished from the rest of the society. And even when we say that 5 or 10% had lived in a world not quite of poverty, let's just remember that the conditions were terrible. No electricity, no indoor plumbing, no modern medicines against diseases or injuries, constant wars that brought death and destruction. That was the condition of man. And then suddenly, beginning in the end of the 1700s, the second half of the 1700s, and the beginning of the 1900s, this began to change for humanity. If you have a diagram of this, what you see is that from the beginning of time till about 1800, standards of living are like practically at the bottom. And then it starts rising like that, not in every country, not at the same time, not in different parts of the world. But from around 1800, 1810, this all changes. So that now we have a global population of not 1 billion, but over 8 billion. And out of that 8 billion people, instead of 90 or 95% living in poverty or desperation, again, economic historians, demographers, and this is from mainstream organizations like the UN and so on, uh, less than 10% live in poverty of any sort. This has been transformative. Now, what this was brought about, how this was brought about, is basically what goes under that general name of the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, there was investment in machinery, tools, equipment, which meant inventions and innovation. Now there were the capacities for individuals to break out of the rigid systems of control, regulations, restrictions by governments, and in the Middle Ages, the guilds that restricted what you could produce without being a member of a guild, how you could produce it, what price you could charge, who you could have as an apprentice, and for how long. All of this began to be changed. Again, not everywhere in Europe at the same time. First in places like Holland and Great Britain, then increasingly in some other countries like France, and then parts of Germany and northern Italy over time. But all of this meant the freeing of the human mind from the controls and restrictions of the government, and the chance to freely try and apply yourself. Now, as a number of economic historians, most recently an economic historian who's also a very staunch libertarian named Deidre McCluskey, has written a trilogy of books on bourgeois virtue, bourgeois dignity, bourgeois equality, uh, covering the last 1,000 years. And what she points out is that the major catalyst for this was a change in attitudes and beliefs, a change in attitudes and beliefs. The changing attitudes and beliefs were that now the individual should not be under the control of some type of a collective, some type of political entity, that the individual should have degrees of liberty to live for himself, earn what he can from his own resources and potentials, and proceed from there. We see this philosophically in the writings of someone like John Locke in his famous two treatises on government at the end of the 1600s, where basically after critiquing and demolishing the rationales, justifications, and superstitions surrounding absolute monarchy, the divine right of kings, basically says that by our reason and as a gift from God, each individual has this natural right to his life, his liberty, and his honestly acquired property to live for himself, not to be under a king, a nobleman, a tribe, a collective, but to live for himself. And that governments are formed not to control and oppress people, but to secure them in these individual rights. And this means that individuals not only have a right to live for themselves, but now human relationships are no longer be based upon force, compulsion, rigid, oppressive tradition, but on free and voluntary association and exchange. So between these changes in attitudes and the change in the philosophical climate, and of course, this does not change overnight, Jacob. It takes years, decades. But by the second half of the 1700s, the second half of the 18th century, in places like Great Britain and increasingly in France and Holland, this idea of liberating man from political and economic restrictions to allow individuals the latitude and liberty to be innovative and creative was set going. And in fact, what one sees is that as the 19th century progresses, is that the human mind has been freed such that new machines, new technologies, new way of doing things, and the ability to keep the income that you have earned, with the result that people could accumulate savings, and then either based upon their own inventive ideas or those they partnered with, could now start investing in factories. That is, the machinery that could generate mass production for masses of the society and to create employment. This itself was liberating. People talk about the evils of the factory systems in the early industrial revolution. And by our standards, Jacob, they certainly were. You and I would not like to work in a factory floor for 12 or 14 hours a day with machinery that was only starting to be developed and could easily result in, without, if a person was not careful, in some forms of injuries, the sanitary conditions, the living conditions. But that was due to the fact that the escape from poverty was just beginning. But for many, many people, as the Industrial Revolution emerged, and particularly in England, is that The people have been tied to the land as serfs or rental peasants. And now the factory systems in places like Manchester and other areas in England were saying, we're looking for workers. Come here. And now people could leave the land, having to work outdoors day and night through all the elements of all the climates changes, come to the factories and work indoors in a covered area that was more secure, indeed, compared to the much of the agricultural circumstances, uh, healthier, even though they don't seem healthy again by our modern standards, and to get higher wages and better working conditions than had existed before. People flocked there. Nobody was brought in chains. Nobody was dragged there under the threat of a whip. People left the countryside and other less productive employments to come to these factories where now they could have, in comparison to agricultural work, less hours. In comparison to agricultural work, a more steady and guaranteed contract income, the ability to interact in ways for intellectual discovery and reflection that you could never do in isolation in the countryside. And slowly but surely, standards of living began to increase, so that particularly in a place like Great Britain, by the 1830s, the 1840s, the 1850s, something began to emerge that had never existed in human history: childhood. From the beginning of time, production was so low, what a person could eke out of their labor in the most primitive instruments was barely enough to feed themselves. So that when a child was born and began to have some elementary intellectual and motor functions, they had to be next to their parents working to generate enough food and output of various sorts to maintain themselves, because their parents did not have the productive output to sustain children who were not working. But now, with the Industrial Revolution, however meager those standards of living and wages may seem again by today's standards, they were rising, such that a man and a woman could earn enough in the factory system that they didn't have to send their child immediately out to work. And there emerged something that had never existed before: play and education. The child could have a playtime when they're young. They could now have the chance to either church schools or regular just charity schools, or if they could afford it, some emerging pay schools, to have the child learn education, to read, to write, to be able to do basic arithmetic and mathematics, to be looking beyond this. This was the era of what was called the penny press in Great Britain. In the 1700s, reading was rare. Most people were illiterate. But by the early decades of the 19th century, it is estimated that 2/3 to 3/4 of the British population had been made literate. People wanted to read. They wanted to know. They wanted to learn. So there was now a market for inexpensive daily or weekly magazines and newspapers. And people absorbed these ferociously. In many factories, as the workers were working at the machines, there would be one worker in the front of the factory area on a platform at a desk, and he would read the day's news to the other workers. First of all, it broke the monotony. It kept you awake so that you less likely of an accident. But you see, the workers would often rotate who read the news out loud to their fellow workers. So people were learning to read, to articulate, to follow the news, to think about what they're reading. In other words, to do public speaking. People were doing all of this, so that by all standards imaginable, by the certainly in England and then in the United States, by the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s, the standards of living compared to the beginning of the 19th century had doubled, had tripled. There was ease and comfort and availabilities, and without government regulation or union coercion, increasingly reduced hours of work, better work conditions, in the employer's own interest, the investment in safer machinery, because if a person gets injured, that stops the work process. You have to wait till he's been removed from wherever he's been injured, and production can start going again. It was in the employer's interest not just to invest in productive and efficient capital equipment, but safer ones to keep the production flowing without interruption. So that by the end of the 19th century, like I said, the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, particularly in countries like Great Britain, the United States, increasingly in places like France and parts of Germany and Holland, there was a wondrous period. If you read the people living at that time, that is in those years before the First World War, all they saw looking back on the 19th century was a miraculous time of scientific innovation, medical advancement, rising productivity, increasing standards of living, that humanity was slowly but surely, unevenly and not for everyone at all of the same places, escaping from poverty. And by those standards of that time, elements of a middle class existence. That was the transformative power of the Industrial Revolution. It made people not only better off, but more humane. They had the means and ability to not only take care of themselves against injury, against medical concerns, but to have charity, to put money aside, to have savings account, to have mutual aid associations such as the Friendly Societies in Great Britain. All of this was a miraculous century due to what? The freeing of the individual from government control and rigid traditional limits, and the creative mind in a free market, in a competitive environment that was increasingly becoming throughout Europe, throughout North America, and then slowly but surely around the rest of the globe.
Well, that's an absolutely excellent exposition on and summary of the Industrial Revolution. You've raised so many good points. Let me amplify on some of them. Your point about how bad living conditions were before the Industrial Revolution is so important. I think I don't recall exactly the essay that Hayek wrote on this issue. Was it Capitalism and the Historians, where he talked about the difference between the standard of living before the Industrial Revolution and compared to today? But what the commentators today, the statist ones, do is they say, look how bad things were compared to where we are today. Well, that's the wrong comparison. The comparison is what the standard of living was in the Industrial Revolution and what came before it. And as you point out, life was nasty, Brutus, and short, that people were just eking out survival. There was, I think it was Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations that said you had to have like 12 kids in a family in order to get a few of them survive into adulthood. People were barely making it. And the major cause of this was government control. The government taxed everybody. Everybody belonged to the state. Everybody was a serf. So all of a sudden, this whole new idea comes in, revolutionary idea, that we're going to let people engage in economic activity freely. That was anathema to the state. They had anti-speculation laws, anti-profiteering laws throughout the Middle Ages, designed to protect the poor. And so all of a sudden, you get this new system saying, we're not going to have any of those protections. People are going to be free to charge whatever they want, engage in any kind of economic transaction they want, and they're going to be free to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth. So in this country, the Constitution calls the government into existence, the federal government. No income tax, no economic regulations, no minimum wages. It shocked the world. I mean, people had never seen this, where government is the servant because people are here accumulating wealth. There's nothing the government can do about it. The government's taxation was very minimal, tariffs, excise taxes, so that there was no huge military establishment. There was certainly no welfare state. And all of a sudden, just this tremendous outburst of creative, positive economic energy. I mean, Richard, to me, Americans really discovered the key to ending poverty, because that's what the Industrial Revolution did. It ended poverty. Now, obviously, in every society, there's always going to be some poor people, but when you look at the overall standard of living and the increase in population that this new system was able to sustain, it's incredible. So you get, as you point out, you get all the way to the 1800s, and I mean, people have saved for generations, and they discovered that those savings go into the banks. The banks lend them out in terms of capital. The employer uses this capital to get better tools, better equipment, better facilities. making the workers more productive, which increases revenue, increases standards of living, wage rates. So it's this perpetual system that is lifting mankind up. I mean, it boggles to mind to think what life would have been like in the United States had that trajectory been allowed to continue. And instead, what happened was what I said earlier in my introduction, that people look at the dismal working conditions and say, oh, we need regulations, we need the welfare state. Ultimately, we need the massive military establishment that then has this tendency to move in the opposite direction, to take the society down. Your point about children playing and people getting an education is a very good one, because it's often thought that it was child labor laws that took these children out of the factories. That's pure nonsense. When a family has a choice of children starving to death or versus sending them into a factory to work long hours where they got a chance to survive, every parent is going to take the second alternative. Duh. Um, but as people started accumulating wealth, their standard of living starts rising. Now that's what enables them to leave the children at home. They got a nest egg there, a savings nest egg. That's what enables them to leave their spouse at home if that's what she chooses to do or he chooses to do. But you can't do that if everybody's on the verge of starvation. And I don't care how many regulations there are against child labor. If that's your only choice, starvation of your children versus working, you're going to violate that provision. So as wealth started being accumulated through savings being passed on with inheritance and so forth down each generation, that's what enabled people to start leaving their children at home. That's what brings into existence the schools, the education, and so forth, and the leisure time, the vacation time. And it's that system, Richard, that we are still benefiting from today. Now, we have a massive welfare state. We have a massive regulated economy, no question about it. Massive military establishment. The government is taking so much of people's income and savings and wealth and so forth. But by and large, the dynamics of this system that stretches all the way back to 1800 or so is still able to produce more wealth than the government's able to confiscate. But who knows how long that can go on, because obviously with $34 trillion in debt, government spending is going out the gazoo, taxing people out the gazoo, both directly and through inflation, through the Federal Reserve's printing press. One never knows, but make no mistake about it, things can turn downward just like they turned upward. And that's why we've got to continue making this case so that we can get back on that trajectory of ever increasing standards of living, especially for those at the bottom of the economic ladder.
Yeah, the question then, of course, arises if someone is listening to what we're saying and sort of at least understanding, if not completely accepting the historical interpretation, the logic, then why did so many people turn towards socialism, to new forms of collectivism? And that is a very interesting question, which a variety of classical liberals in the late 19th and early 20th century tried to grapple with as they saw this shift back towards collectivism and away from political and economic individualism occurring. And some of the arguments are the following. First of all, a couple of them pointed out that the triumph of free trade in Great Britain, which set the tone not just for Britain into the 20th century, but also a model for other countries, is that people accepted free trade in the early decades of the 19th century, not because they had all studied Adam Smith, as one says, but that because of the poverty and the starvation that was going on in the 1830s and 1840s in Ireland with the potato famine, then huge rains that destroyed the wheat crops. People were facing starvation, and the advocates of free trade had said, if you want cheap food, then we have to break the power of the vested interests who want protectionism, restrictions, and allow food to come in from other countries not facing these environmental hardships right now. The cheap loaf, as it was said. But that, well, many people had saw the logic of, cheap food and food on the table for your children, and they're not starving or threatened with starvation. that they had not followed through with understanding the conceptual logic of all that would be entailed in this. And so and that at the same time, particularly in the 1870s and 1880s, as poverty was being reduced, not to the extent that it continued to be reduced at the end of the 20th and now the beginning of the 21st century, as I was mentioning at the beginning. But in comparison to what they and their parents had lived through, they became impatient. Look here, there's so much more wealth. There's so much rising standards of living for so more people in the society. Yet look at the remaining poverty. So many people working still long hours in factories with very meager or very modest standards of living. Children not properly clothed. Surely we've been achieving so much. Can't we rush it a bit and help all those who are still lagging behind this great productive possibility? And maybe the state can come in, and with redistribution and regulation, we can accelerate the process of eliminating more from poverty. Now, that was a false trail to follow. But as you were just saying, once you turn back to that, the very attempts that you think are going to assist those who are still lagging behind where you have been able to reach up so far, or as an intellectual, you think the society should be for everyone, the very method you choose, redistribution of wealth, higher taxation on those who have saved and invested, regulation of industry in the name of assisting those who are in less good conditions than yourselves in the workplace, ends up being counterproductive. It decelerates the process of saving the investment in capital formation. It undermines incentives to redistribution. It retards the competitive and innovative improvements in the workplace that naturally come from the market. And then on top of this, where the intellectuals who just imagined a world that would be perfect. Imagine I could conjure up a world, a utopia, in which there's no want, there's no worry. We all share in common the wealth that we can produce. Why, we need a variation of the collectivist theme, either socialism or more radical communism, or we're all in it together as a national group, and therefore a national socialism, as began to occur in Imperial Germany under Bismarck, where within the bounds of Imperial Germany, we're concerned with the welfare of Germans, and therefore the first modern national healthcare system, the first modern social security type system, the first interventions for the German workers in the workplace and restrictions on private business. So it's either a universal socialism or sort of a nation-bound socialism. But these kind of attitudes, impatience, and ideological shifts is what brought around the change of the tides of the time that now continued into the 20th century and have left us less free than we could be if freedom, as you were saying, had been allowed to continue and progress.
All right. On that eloquent note, we'll wrap things up. We're out of time. As always, Richard, greatly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation on the Industrial Revolution. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.